It's nice to see so many people come out on a day where there's so much going on in Ithaca, and it's such a beautiful day outside. It's kind of not the best place to be. It's not sunny. We don't have windows in here, but we do have great writers come through. You're all here for Tina Welling. Tina Welling is here. She comes to us from Wyoming, Jackson Hole, where she is on the Jackson Hole Writers Conference you've been on it for 15 years. So I'm asking Q&A here. Author of novels, has written for nonfiction publications, and she's got a great book, which she's going to talk about today, Writing Wild, which is about writing and nature and how they kind of go together. I'm going to stop talking. I am going to say that book is on sale here, so be sure to pick up a copy. Welcome, Tina Welling.
I'm very glad you're all here. You live in a beautiful town. We went to Watkins Glen yesterday, and just driving around and just smelling the air. I'm just swooning all the time. Everything's blooming, and I was telling Ellen that the lilacs in Jackson Hole will bloom probably around the 4th of July. So this is just really great to have all of this color and your many trees. It's just a wonderful place that you live in, and I like the community very much. And it reminds me quite a lot of Jackson Hole. Met somebody who's been living in Jackson Hole, just moved here 10 years ago. That seems amazing to me. So, my book, it's the 4th one. I've written novels prior to this, although I actually wrote this first draft before the novels were published, and then just been rewriting it. And when I was doing those novels, there was kind of a fast deadline thing going on, which made me pretty miserable. So after the 3rd one, I went back to look at this, and it held energy for me, and I decided it was worth working on some more years, which I did. In the beginning, before my novels were published, I had lots of rejections, and I think the time I probably went public, maybe for the first time, is when my house was being built, and I lived in a small log cabin, and then we were moving another small log cabin onto it, and then building kind of a shingled, more contemporary to join the two. And I owned a shop in Jackson Hole then, a resort shop, and I came home for lunch, and I noticed that the workers had left wet cement on the footers, and they had gone off for lunch as well. So I found a stick, and I wrote words in the footers. I didn't even know to call them footers. I was thinking it was just the foundation of the house. But I wrote creativity and flow and exchange, and where the area where my writing cabin would be placed. And then I wrote other favorite words like fun and well-being and generosity in different places around. And then I went in the house to fix lunch. And pretty soon there was this banging on the door, and I went to the door, and it was the crew boss. And he said, "Ma'am," his face is just fallen. He says, "I don't know what happened. Everything was just fine when we left." And I start looking around for my dog, thinking, well, maybe they, encased her in cement or something, and I didn't notice. He was so distraught. And he says, "Somebody has vandalized the footers. There is graffiti written all over them." I said, "Oh, that was me." He said, "Ma'am?" I said, "I did that." And the crew is all lined up on the driveway, and he looks at them and he said, "She did it." And so then I thought, well, they went to this trouble to smooth it all out, and really I should kind of explain myself. So I said, I just wrote some of my favorite words in the footers, and that's what I did. And he said, just to let me know how really stupid he thought that whole plan was, he said, "Well, ma'am, the house is going to be built on top of them, You won't be able to read those words." I said, "It's okay, go ahead and build the house." And then the men walked around, and you can't read my writing all that well, and especially when I do it in cement. And so, "Bob, what's this one say?" "Clarity." And they would holler this across the foundation, the different words they could figure out. And they just really had a very low opinion of me from that point on. But that might have been my first publication. So I brought some huckleberry taffy from Jackson Hole to pass around. And also I brought a list, put your name on it if you'd like a drawing for just a small gift that I brought. And then another small gift that I brought will be in one of the books that will be for sale. I have signed favorite scenes, and so if you get that book, then I have a small present for you. And just yeah, and if you'd like to do your email and be in contact, I'd love that.
Good.
So I forgot to tell you that on my side of the bedroom, the new bedroom that was going to be built, I wrote joy and vitality. And on my husband's side, I wrote serenity and beauty. So I really got that one messed up because the sleeping is a lot more peaceful over there. So I'm going to read just a couple paragraphs of how this kind of got started with me. I once read an account about a woman who had been struck by lightning, causing her severe nerve damage. Afterward, what mattered in her life changed completely, and she felt grateful for the experience. Except for the nerve damage, this was what happened to me when I began to wake up to the world around me. This is chapter 1, the first paragraph. It all started with a postcard. I was on my way to opening the Rosebud, my resort shop in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, but stopped first at the health food store to pick up coffee and pastry. There it was, right on the counter, a postcard with a picture of Earth taken from space. Against a shiny black sky, our planet glowed with swirly blues and purples, framed by 2 lines of a message. Wake up, you live here. Normally, my first concern might have been the overuse of exclamation points. But this morning, the message itself punched me smack in the chest and set off an alarm inside. I had just been outdoors, but I couldn't say what the sky looked like, cloudy or clear, or whether birds sang, or if I'd felt a breeze on my cheeks. I'd been locked inside my head thinking. I didn't live with awareness inside my own body, much less on the earth. After that, a phrase I'd heard all of my life, come to your senses, began to take on new meaning for me. I abruptly awakened to my senses, to dramatic consequence. My husband joked about an alien spirit descending into my body, but it was just me. I descended into my body. Yet things don't really happen all of a sudden, I know. They just seem to occur that way. And it certainly seemed to my husband John, and even to me, that I'd changed suddenly. But I believe now that the changes just took time to accumulate. It's like the arrival of spring. It happens so gradually that we think it's sudden the moment we notice the tatting of green on bare tree limbs. Looking back, I realized that getting in touch with my creative energy began the process of alerting me to life. I changed bit by bit over many years as I dove deeper into my writing and my relationship with the natural world. I liked this heightened awareness, and I wanted to be even more conscious of life around me. That morning in the health food store, I was tapped on the shoulder by life itself, and I was finally ready to answer the call. So here's the postcard. I came across it, just thought I probably had one tucked away someplace. And it's true. Lots of things changed for me after that. It seemed that I had been quite a dependent wife and mother, one of those that if somebody asked me how I was, I might tell them how my husband was or my kids. And I kept thinking to myself, well, if I just get everyone else happy, then I'll be happy. But as the boys grew older, we had 2 sons and became a little bit more independent. I had a little bit of time, and I couldn't have told you what made me happy. I did not know myself very well at all. And it all sort of came together with this waking up to the natural world. I had been longing to write. I had found many reasons why it wasn't important enough for me to spend the time, the energy, get the space, all of that. And I began to do that as well. And it seemed that it was like a big soup in my life, and I didn't recognize it until some time had gone by. But things had changed internally for me. Therefore, they kind of change with your relationships, especially when you've been a people pleaser and kind of devoted your life to doing that sort of thing. There's a little rebellion in the family. So I'll read an excerpt from when the whole thing with the natural world really kind of was seeded, I'd say. One summer I hiked, this is the first part of the introduction, by the way. One summer day I hiked Josie's Ridge on Snow King Mountain. Large clouds moved across the sky and periodically put a lid over the sun. I paused to catch my breath from the upslope climb and gazed around the shadowy forest of tall, lanky pines. My glance caught on a fully rounded tree, leafless and apparently dead, standing upright with an abundance of sweeping limbs, making the tree stand out from others. At that moment, the sun broke through the cloud cover, and as I stood there, a dense, dew-beaded spiderweb, lacing the branches top to bottom, was abruptly illuminated. One moment, the dead tree was notable only for its shapely flare, unusual in a harsh, high-altitude environment. The next moment, it was aflame with stars. My throat tightened and tears stung my eyes. The forest was silent, I was alone, and the trees spangled before me, woven with fairy lights. Then the clouds closed over the sun again, and the sparkle was gone. I stood in those shadowy woods, looking at the bare tree, and my mind experienced a gracious leap. Skipping over the small steps of understanding, I knew suddenly that there was an interconnectedness between the earth's creative energy and my own personal creative energy. Writing Wild was conceived right then. I wanted to understand more about this connection. I wanted to explore those small, intuitive steps of knowing, to lay them out one by one, untangle the workings of that connection, and learn how to use this natural resource. By that time, I had been working with the Jackson Hole Writers Conference, but I wasn't on the faculty. I was on the staff. It was a part-time thing, and then I was writing, and a lot of the time I was writing secretly. It was one of those awkward times in which you feel like you're an imposter because you're really living in this writer's perspective while everybody else treats you as a service employee, as they did in my shop, or a grocery shopper or whatever. And then there comes this time where you have to make a decision. Do I keep this a secret or do I tell everybody? And I felt like that was a challenge for me when I was ready. But then there was a lot of pity because the only relationship people have with writers is, are you published yet? And so then you have to say, no, no, not yet. And so you have to be kind of strong when you get to that place, but it's an important place. And all of that helped to just make me feel that I was living my more authentic self. And although it was a little hard to tell the family I wasn't going to be sitting here watching television, I was going to go up and write, I did that. And I longed to do that. And it became such a love for me that just by that, I think I grew stronger and stronger. And while this was happening, the natural world was this natural companion for me. I began to challenge myself to walk in the mountains. And I was kind of a homebody in a way. I mean, my family didn't do outside sports. They played bridge and that kind of thing, and maybe golf, And so for me to have hiking boots and head on down a canyon it took some courage. It just wasn't anything I was familiar with. And but I loved it, so I would just go out longer and longer, go further and further into the canyon, higher up into the mountains, and I did it by myself, and I just grew again in that way. So it was all just kind of all of this stuff happening at once, and not happening as fast as it seemed, although it seemed that way to, people around me, I think, as well as sometimes to me. So when I came across the idea of this connection between our creative energy and that of the natural world, the macrocosm, microcosm pattern, I wanted to get that all organized somewhat so that I could really reclaim it whenever I needed to. So I did a lot of reading, I did a lot of writing to figure out what it is that I wanted to know, what it was that I might already know, that I could bring up from just the unconscious to the consciousness. And so then I eventually came across what I call a spirit walk, and it's 3 simple basic steps. The first one is naming. It's the thing that happens to all of us as babies. We start naming. And when you go out into the backyard or into the woods and begin to just name what your senses bring you, you are awakening yourself. You're becoming rooted in place. You're aware of the breezes, the bird song, the smells, and it's physically, intuitively, emotionally, mentally waking. And then the second step is to take one thing, and I use the example of a pine cone in the book, and go through your senses with just this one thing, really detailing. And you taste it too, you know? So you have to be careful what you choose. There's some things you wouldn't want to taste. But that's really deepening the relationship. And the third step happens on its own. Memories rise, stories rise, emotions rise, because that's where they're stored in our bodies. And so they can be your material for writing, for painting, for journaling. It's your original material. And it's amazing that this works well, but it's like being in the company of a very trusted friend. The whole idea is building this relationship with the natural world, and so that you are opening yourself, you are making yourself vulnerable to it the way you do when you fall in love. And I'll read an excerpt of how that came to my aid one late night. So, naming and describing organize the senses and the information that rushes toward us. Often when I feel excitement over something and want desperately to remember the particulars, I nearly numb out with the overload of emotion and information. If I try to take in the whole picture, I can't recall anything meaningful, only the general outlines of the event. So my story and my memory are flattened by the lack of detail. For example, one winter night, hours after I'd gone to sleep, my pup Tess began barking. She didn't go to the front of the house or even the bedroom door. She stood before my tall bedroom windows and barked so hard her front paws lifted off the floor. I tiptoed out of bed, afraid of what I might see. An escaped convict prying open my window came to mind. I peeked outside of the edge of the heavy velvet drapery that keeps out sub-zero drafts. There, inches from the window glass, was a mother moose and her young leggy twins. They were eating the rose hips that grow wild in a tangle with the willows beside my window. At first, I was filled with wonder and couldn't take it all in. But then I slowed myself and did a mental spirit walk right there. I named what my senses brought to my attention. Red berries capped with snow, chomping sounds, chilled bare feet, too cold to smell anything, too excited to taste anything. Still, I did pretty well, and next I began to notice details. My reward. I saw snowflakes in the eyelashes of the mother moose. If I hadn't broken my experience down into separate pieces, I never would have seen that while trying to take in the whole wonderful event of moose in my yard. After a while, Mama lay down in the snow beside the willows. Her twins lay down next to her. I dragged open the draperies to expose the whole width of the window and went back to bed. From my pillows, I could see the three of them sleeping in the snow, dreaming moose dreams. I fell asleep with the same kind of contentment I remember from childhood when crawling into bed with my grandparents in the night. So I think that if your list is been passed around, I'll pick that up. And we'll, did you guys get to put your name down? Okay.
Hey, I can't win anything.
No.
Oh,
I'm sorry. But you can pick the number from 1 to 18.
1 to 18. 13.
Okay, 13. I've left my glasses at this.
Chow Chang.
Chow Chang. Hey. Okay, what I got from Jackson Hole, you've heard the term, think outside the box. I'll bring it to you. This is just think outside.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'm good for taking questions. If anybody's got any questions. If not, I'll ask you. How about who journals? Any of you journal? And how many of you are writers? Better raise your hand, Linda. I did that once at Jackson Hole Writers Conference. It's just supposed to be writers, when I was doing a workshop. And so raise your hand if you're a writer. Not too many did, It was just one of those things of claiming, which is kind of hard to do when you're in a conference with some big people you've been reading or something, for half your life. Jill.
Could you talk about how the body is an important part of this book?
Yes, it's like the microcosm of the earth being our greater body. But first, we really do have to have a relationship with our own bodies, and I didn't. I prided myself on banging my shin against the coffee table and using my mind to direct it in another direction, and then later when I'm taking a shower and I see the big bruise, it's like, what the heck's that, and where'd that come from? I did that so well. I was raised that way. Came from a family we're all come from a culture that admires the intelligence, and the body is something we buy clothes for, and maybe berate and say bad things about. But I found that was necessary for me first to be aware of the body, and then I, of course, recognize that's where the emotions are, that's where my stories are, that's how they're being triggered. And I go through that quite a lot in the book and tell a story. And in the beginning I tell a story of going up that same mountain, Snow King Mountain. My house is in front of it, and the ski resort is on it where my shop was. And I tell the story about being afraid going up on the chairlift in the summertime when I had gone up for, years, with my skis on in the wintertime. And in the wintertime, it zips up there and there's no safety gate that comes down in front of you because you have to slide on and slide right off, and you have to do it really quick. And so I was suddenly very afraid when I had been looking forward to it, because you can see all the way to Yellowstone up there, which, it's a long ways away. And suddenly I'm just so afraid and I can't figure it out, and I think, I'm going to have to come down on it, or else walk a really long ways. And I went through the spirit walk process. I did the naming. I spent lots of time up there because it was my outing, and I had my journal with me. And then I did the detailing with the pine cone, and then I found this tree that I called a lap tree. It had a deadfall had fallen across it when it was growing, so it grew into a place you could just sit real comfortably. And I began to write, and suddenly this memory came. And in the book, I collapse the memory and talk about it in terms of just being my dad and me, but actually it was her mother, my dad, and me. We were in the Ferris wheel at the fair. I was sitting with my Aunt Iva, Elaine's mother, and my dad was in front of us, or in back of us. I guess he was in back of us. And the idiot's sliding himself out of the Ferris wheel so that he can kick ours in front of us and make us scared. And, I was really, really frightened, and he was mostly teasing his sister. And I begged him to stop, and he just thought I was just being silly, or he was toughening me up, which was part of what he thought his job was. I never rode a Ferris wheel again, ever. It really frightened me. I imagined myself just tumbling down past all those glittering lights and, slapping down on the pavement. And that whole memory, of which I didn't remember a thing about, just rose up, and I realized that was what scared me about the chairlift, and it seemed to dissolve it. And it was just a very clean, clear example of how these stories are in our bodies and how we can retrieve them. Anybody else? Yeah,
Do you use this method in your novels?
Well, I do, in the way of identifying with someone else, and I think I've sort of put it into just me outdoors. I just enjoy it so much, and it wakes me up to the extent that I feel like I am more alert, more capable of writing, and writing from somebody else's point of view. Now I put my lunch, my journal, and my knitting in my backpack, and skis on if it's wintertime, or hiking boots, and I just go until I don't see people, and then I kind of like camp for the day, Just find a nice place to sort of hang out. In the summertime, it's often by a lake, and in the winter, if I'm lucky enough to find a fallen tree I can brush the snow off of so I don't actually, my butt doesn't freeze to the snow mound. And it helps me in every way. It's become just sort of a part of what I do. I really recommend it. It really especially is very distinctive for me when I'm journal writing. If I can go out there and do that, I can get to some connection with the confusion that I'm feeling. And I might not come away with solutions, but I'll come away with greater clarity.
It's one thing walking through the woods and taking your journal out and saying, the sun came through the trees and then I saw a spider web. But your phraseology is so beautiful, and I think that's what draws one to continue to read a book, is there's a certain word order or a phraseology that is elegant and lovely. And where do you think that comes from?
I think it comes from the body. And I think that we get there through our senses, which are the power lines between us and the natural world. And so that's what we typically do. We'll go out, we'll talk about what we see, because that's our culture, see. We use that word see for I understand, or many things that have to do with the mental. But if we can get on down to smell, that's a part of the reptile brain, the very center, and that's more embodied. And so I think it's very much a body thing. Those are the kind of writers I like, that I feel have that ability, or opening to it, It's kind of vulnerability. I think being a writer or an artist of any kind demands a kind of vulnerability, a willingness to be open, a willingness to feel pain, a willingness to acknowledge joy, a whole spectrum. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, did you ever know, or she's a legend, I think, in Jackson Hole, Margaret E. Murray?
Oh, well, I didn't know her, but yeah, I've been around, and her cabins are preserved, and so, yeah, I go there for, hanging around sometimes.
And truly, I don't think she would have been able to write that if she hadn't journaled for maybe 20 years before she wrote it.
I think you're right. I think journaling does that. It gets us in that willingness to be intimate, and intimate on the page, and then the whole thing with language, But my favorite advice, I'll pass that on because I love it so much. I got it from William Stafford. He's a poet. He's no longer living. But I took him on the Wyoming tour for quite a long time ago. Wyoming's kind of small people, so if there's somebody that knows how to read and there's a poet in town, you might be taking them around on the tour. And at least that's the way it was in the beginning. And he said, lower your standards, And so I think that is this thing that frees us. And I guess my wish for all of you is to be freed. Because Linda and I were talking when she first arrived about wanting to write, but it's time to garden. And then, she's just retired, so before, I'm sure your job got in the way. There's always going to be something. But it's so dearly important to tune in with yourself and follow your longing. Follow your longing. It's what wakes you up. It's what makes life full, what makes life meaningful. So yeah, lower your standards, and I use it for everything. If you've been to my house, I lower my standards when it comes to dusting. I lower my standards when it comes just about to everything. It's become very handy for me, and I write about that too.
It's wonderful to hear all you're saying. And so often I think when somebody says something that we ourselves haven't been able to articulate, but it speaks to us, this is particularly beautiful to hear that. And for some reason what came to my mind is I think it was Simone De Beauvoir, and I think she was a fairly young woman. She was really in a soulful kind of crisis. And she ended up, her one guiding light she could come up with was to just walk every day as far as she could, sort of out in the countryside, I think, of France. And I don't know, if she experienced any of the sorts of things you are talking about, but I think it's perhaps likely.
Yes.
It was.
Yes. And I walked for years without being aware of what I was doing, and that's really what I wanted to do, is be wake walking.
Right.
I felt like I had been sleepwalking before, because I would just get into my head, and before you know it, I had walked and gotten home already, you know. So, yeah. Well, thank you very much.